Chapter 015 Busy Friday. Zorian felt a charged marble approaching him, but didn't move. He couldn't tell whether it was aimed to the left or to the right, but he knew it wasn't aimed at his forehead. He could always tell when it was. Always. He wasn't sure how he could tell it with absolute certainty when he could not actually pinpoint where the marble was going, but he was grateful for it. He just wished he could replicate that success to the exercise in general. The marble was past him and he struggled to identify on which side it passed him by. Left, he tried. Wrong, Xvim said in a disinterested tone. Again. Another marble was thrown towards him. This one wasn't aimed at his forehead either. Not that surprising, really. Xvim stopped doing that when he realized Zorian could identify those with perfect accuracy. It wouldn't do to give Zorian free points, after all. Right, he said. Wrong, Xvim immediately responded. Again. Zorian frowned behind the blindfold. Did it just seem that way, or was he actually getting worse at this as time went by? Something was very wrong here. At the beginning of the session he was getting more than half of them correctly, but now he was constantly getting it wrong. He'd have thought he'd guess correctly every once in a while, through statistical inevitability if nothing else. There were only two possibilities. That's why, when Xvim threw the next marble, Zorian quickly wrenched the blindfold off to see what the deal was. The marble flew straight over his head. That son of a bitch. I didn't say you could take the blindfold off, Xvim calmly said, as if Zorian didn't just catch him red-handed. That's cheating. Zorian protested, completely ignoring Xvim's remark. Of course I couldn't guess correctly if you're not even going to abide by your own rules. You're not supposed to guess, Mr. Kaczynski, Xvim said unapologetically. You're supposed to sense. I was sensing, Zorian ground out. If you were, you would have realized what was happening far sooner, and you would not have needed to take off the blindfold to identify the problem, Xvim said. Now stop wasting your time and put the blindfold back on so we can continue. Zorian cursed Xvim mentally but did as he was told. As much as he hated to admit it, Zorian had to admit there was a lot of truth in Xvim's words. He had been mostly guessing over which shoulder the marbles were going, relying on gut instinct instead of a clear perception of its location. But it was hardly his fault he couldn't reliably track a fast-moving object through its Feynman emissions. According to books, that was a highly advanced skill that took years to master. Honestly, asking a student to master this sort of thing in their third year was completely unreasonable. But completely in character for Xvim, he supposed. At least he no longer had to worry about being hit in the head anymore. The rest of the session was typical, which is to say repetitive and boring. Then again, what part of school wasn't boring at this point? He had been stuck in the time loop for a little over a year now, and feigning attention during classes was starting to get hard. He was tempted to take a page out of Zach's book and go wander somewhere else for a few restarts, but he couldn't. For one thing, it would be irresponsible to waste time like that when he could be working on skills he needed to get to the bottom of this. For another, he didn't want to attract attention to himself. The memory of their interaction was probably still fresh in Zach's mind, and there was a possible third party to consider. Completely blowing off classes would be completely out of character for him, and would raise a lot of eyebrows. He was already playing it close by taking Cariel with him and skipping almost a quarter of his classes to do his own thing, but those changes were at least easily explainable. If his current course of action didn't produce results, he'd have to drop the masquerade to preserve his sanity, but that wasn't an immediate concern. He had more pressing problems to worry about, so he put off that issue for later, when and if it became relevant. His session with Xvim done, he went to the library to report to Kiridashli. Normally he didn't go to work on Fridays, since dealing with Xvim tended to kill his mood very fast, but he was feeling just fine today. He was getting used to the irritating man's antics, it seemed. Zorian. Kiridashli greeted. Good timing. We just got a new shipment today and Ibri had to go home early. Okay, Zorian said slowly. He was about to ask what kind of shipment arrived, but then he decided it was a stupid question. It was a shipment of books, of course. What do you want me to do? Just unpack the books out of their boxes and separate them into rough categories, answered Kiridashly, pointing in the direction of a small mountain of boxes. I'll inspect them in more detail later to see what to do with them. You don't know what to do with them? Asked Zorian, baffled. Why did you order them, then? I didn't, Kiridashly said, shaking her head. Someone donated their personal library to the Academy. It happens from time to time. Sometimes people leave their books to us in their wills, or people who inherit them don't have a use for them and can't sell them. A lot of old books are only useful as historical curiosities, and sometimes not even that. Most of the books in these boxes will be disposed of, to be honest. Oh? Asked Zorian, opening one of the boxes and pulling out one of the books stacked inside of it. It was a manual about cultivation of plums. The cover said it was published 20 years ago. I'm surprised by that. I distinctly remember you saying that librarians should preserve everything they can rather than pick and choose what they think is good or useful. Oh, shut up, Kiridashly grouched, taking a half-hearted swipe at him that he dodged. It's an ideal to be followed, not an unbreakable law. There is only so much space in the library, no matter how big it appears. And besides, most of these books are duplicates of ones we already have. Stop being a wussius and get to work. Zorian threw himself to the task, unpacking box after box. Kiridashly gave him a huge book that contained list after list of the most common books they received in these sorts of deliveries and told him to use it to separate the obvious duplicates from the rest. Using the book manually to find the matches would be a total nightmare, of course, especially since the letters were in a really tiny print in order to cram as many words as possible on every page, but Zorian knew it was designed with something else in mind. One of the spells he learned from Iberi in the previous restarts involved making a list of terms you wanted to search for and then connecting the list via divination spell to a target book you wanted to search. It sounded a little pointless to him back then, but now he realized it was made with precisely this sort of thing in mind. And the huge, densely packed reference book was probably made with the spell in mind, in turn. Nearly 2 hours and 20 hastily scribbled lists later he had separated the duplicates from the rest of the books and was in the process of leafing through one of the spellbooks he had found in the boxes when Kiridashly finally returned from wherever she had disappeared after giving him his assignment. His rapid progress surprised her, seeing how she had no idea he was so well versed in library magic, and she apparently also found it a little disappointing. "You're no fun," she sighed dramatically. "I wanted to show you that trick when I came back, after you spent 2 hours painstakingly searching for matches in that monster of a book. The expression on your face would have been priceless." Zorian simply raised an eyebrow at her, but otherwise stayed silent. Kiridashly showed her maturity by sticking her tongue at him like a 5-year-old, before eyeing the book he was leafing through. "Found something interesting?" she asked. "Not really," Zorian said, snapping the book shut. "There was nothing particularly interesting in it anyway. I sort of hoped I would find a book on powerful ancient magic and the like, but no such luck." Kiridashly snorted. "Even if you did find something like that, it would do little good. Contrary to what various adventure novels may have led you to believe, ancient magic is almost always inferior to what we have available now. Those spells that are lost are usually lost for a good reason, generally for being too impractical, requiring ingredients or conditions that no longer exist, or because they would be considered massively unethical in the modern age. For example, you'd be hard-pressed to find participants for orgy ritual magic these days. Anti-Hawaiian volcanic spells relied on conditions present in one particular volcano that hasn't been active for more than 200 years. Zorian blinked. "Oh. Well, that's disappointing." "Quite," Kiridashly agreed. "And even when those spells can be cast without issue, they tend to be infuriatingly inflexible and long to cast. Mages of old didn't have the sort of shaping skills modern mages have, so they compensated by making their spells long and hyper-specialized. There were hundreds of color-changing spells, for instance, but most of them differed only in which color the spell changed the affected objects into. It has been a persistent trend in modern times to generalize spells, since better training methods allow modern mages to make up for the spell's lack of precision with the sheer control they have over their magic. Making a lot of old spells obsolete to a properly trained mage, finished Zorian. He had always known that most history books presented a heavily idealized image of their ancestors, their portrayal of the desertification of northern Mycenae. He refused to call it cataclysm, as if it was some natural occurrence beyond Ecosian control, and subsequent exodus to Altasia was proof enough that they were given a sugar-coated version of history, but he hadn't realized Ecosians were also crappy mages in addition to being short-sighted assholes. And you have to be one if you plan to get certified. You know, I've always wondered why so many really easy spells are classified as first circle ones. I thought it might be a deliberate policy by the guild to encourage certification, but I guess a lot of those were not nearly as trivial when they were first rated. But you also have to consider things from the perspective of the spell's maker, Kiridishli said. It's a lot more prestigious and profitable to make a first circle spell than a 0th circle one. So they almost never classify a spell as anything less than first circle, and the guild allows them to get away with it, probably for the very reason you stated. A determined person could probably get the guild to lower the classification on a lot of those spells, but you'd make a lot of enemies, especially the spellcrafter interest groups. It would be a thankless task, and you'd constantly have to watch out for people trying to roll back the changes. Zorian digested this information in silence. He had no intention of involving himself in such high-level politics, of course, either in the time loop or outside of it. If there was one thing his parents had driven into his skull with their endless sermons, it was that his strengths did not lie in that area. Granted, that probably wasn't what those sermons were designed to do, but that wasn't his problem. Still, things like these were useful to know. He'd have to prod Kiridishli for more stories in the future. Break. When Kiridishli told him to go home, Zorian was all too happy to oblige her. It had been a long and boring day, what with the regular classes, his session with Xvim, and working in the library, and all he really wanted was to go back to Imaya's place and relax. Sadly, it was not to be, because the moment he stepped out of the library he was accosted by a shady-looking man that had been waiting for him just outside the entrance. Well, maybe accosted was a too strong of a word. Technically, the man in question was just leaning on a pillar next to the entrance, not blocking his path or even speaking to him. Nonetheless, the moment the man glanced up and their eyes met, Zorian knew the man had been waiting for him, and him alone. Middle-aged, dressed in a cheap, rumpled suit and unshaven, he almost looked like one of Sioria's many homeless people, but there was a confidence in his posture that didn't fit that image. He halted in his tracks instantly, and an uneasy silence descended on the scene as they both analyzed one another. Zorian had no idea who the man was or what he wanted to do with him, but he wasn't inclined to be charitable. He had not forgotten the way he was assassinated in one of the initial restarts, and had no wish to repeat the experience. "Zorian Kaczynski?" the man finally asked. "That's me," confirmed Zorian. He didn't think lying would work, and it would be better to have a confrontation close to the library than to get ambushed in an empty street on the way home. "Detective Haslushik Zeteri, Sioria's police department," the man said. "Ilsa sent me to be your divination instructor." Zorian didn't know what to say. Ilsa picked a detective as his instructor? So much for his idea of talking his new divination instructor into teaching him the restricted divination skills he needed to actually investigate this time loop business. Why did it have to be law enforcement, of all things? "That's great," Zorian said flatly. "I was wondering when Ilsa would find someone." If his lack of enthusiasm bothered the man any, he didn't show it. He turned and walked away, gesturing Zorian to follow after him. "Come on, kid, let's go find a tavern to sit in," he said, shoving his hands into the pockets of his jacket. Oh yes, a tavern, the perfect learning environment. Gods, not only was the man a detective, he was unprofessional as well. His unkempt appearance sort of suggested it right from the start, but Zorian always tried to not judge too harshly on appearances alone. Too many people did it to him, and he always found it very annoying. His thoughts must have been more visible in his demeanor than he thought they were, because the man quickly started to justify himself. "Come now, don't look at me like that," the man said. "It's not like we'll be doing anything too serious today. It's been a long day for both of us, I think. You're tired, I'm tired, we don't know each other, and we'll accomplish nothing if we just jump straight into lessons right away. Hell, maybe we'll decide we don't like each other and call this whole thing off. So today, we're just going to share a drink and talk." Okay, so maybe Slush was smarter and more capable than Zorian gave him credit for. He had to stop judging people so quickly. Though. "I don't drink alcohol," Zorian warned. Slush gave him a curious look. "Religious taboo?" Zorian shook his head. He was never very religious. The gods had been silent for centuries, and as far as Zorian was concerned that meant they either killed each other off or abandoned their creations to fend for themselves. Hell, listening to some of the stories from the Age of Gods, he couldn't help but think humanity was better off without them. They had a disturbing tendency to throw around plagues and curse entire cities on the flimsiest of pretexts. He didn't think it was a coincidence that humanity only started to advance, both socially and technologically, after the gods had fallen silent. "Bad experiences," he simply said, not wanting to discuss that topic any further. "Ah," Slush said, content with his answer. "That's okay, you can order some fruit juice or something. Hell, I can even show you a spell I use when I'm on duty but don't want to offend people by refusing an offered drink." Now that sounded useful. Zorian looked at Slush, and the man correctly interpreted that as permission to go on. "It's a neat little alteration spell that converts alcohol into sugar," Slush said, raising his right hand to show a plain metal ring on his middle finger. "I have it imprinted into this ring so I don't have to visibly cast it. Visibly casting a spell on your drink is often resented even more than outright refusing it, believe it or not. The moment I touch the glass the deed is done." "Convenient," Zorian said appreciatively. That spell would have saved him so much trouble over the years. "But I thought organic matter cannot be restructured through alteration spells?" "Usually not, but that's because most of them are impossibly complex and poorly understood, not because organic compounds are somehow impossible to replicate," Slush said, studying various tavern signs as they walked. Apparently he wasn't merely looking for the closest one. Both ethanol and glucose are fairly simple molecules, and quite well understood, so there is no difficulty in converting one into the other. He suddenly stopped in front of a nearby sign, studying it for a moment before turning to face Zorian again. "I think this is a nice place. What do you think?" Zorian's experiences with taverns were very limited and generally unpleasant, so he simply gestured at Slush to go in before following after him. It wasn't as bad as Zorian had feared. The insides of the tavern were dark and the air was a bit stale, but the tables were clean and the noise was manageable. Slush picked an out-of-the-way table in the corner and cast a long, complicated spell on it after they both ordered a drink. Probably a privacy ward of some kind. Zorian expected the man to start interrogating him the moment the spell snapped into place, but it didn't play out like that. If Slush was interrogating him, he was doing it too subtly for Zorian to notice. Hell, the man didn't even ask him about Damon, which was always nice. Gradually, Zorian began to relax and started asking questions of his own. Questions like how come a detective has time and inclination to tutor a third-year student in divination magic? "Huh?" snorted Slush. "A good question. Usually something like this would be the last thing on my mind, but yesterday my commander dumped a really silly case on my lap. Apparently there's a rumor circulating around the city about mentalist spiders lurking in the sewers, and I'm supposed to check it out." He rolled his eyes with a sigh. "Mentalist spiders, honestly," he mumbled. Zorian struggled not to let his surprise show and somehow succeeded, largely because Slush was paying more attention to his drink than to him at the moment. He started a rumor without even realizing it. He supposed he shouldn't be surprised, since he had told Tivan about the spiders right in front of Imaya and his sister. Between Tivan and those two, they probably blathered about it to a dozen people at least. Anyway, After work I went to meet with my good friend Ilse so we could complain about our problems to each other over a drink or two, when she told me she was having problems finding a divination tutor for you. And at that point I realized I have a perfect solution for my problem. I could pawn off the case to some other poor schmuck, help a friend in need, and settle a long-standing argument between me and my commander in one fell swoop. See, a couple of years ago the bureaucrats in Eldamar decided to launch an initiative for getting more mages interested in a career in law enforcement. Only, instead of doing something concrete to attract new talent, they asked mages already working inside the police force to go introduce the profession to mages in training on their own initiative. Ah, said Zorian. So you're supposed to do things like this anyway. Yeah, but I've been kind of slacking off in that regard, so my commander is constantly nagging me about missing my quota. Can you blame me though? We get paid extra for doing it, but it's a pittance considering the hassle. You know better than I do, Zorian shrugged. How does, introducing me to the profession get you off the spider case, though? I don't have time to do both, Slush said. He frowned for a second and then shook his head, as if to clear it. Yup. That's my story and I'm sticking to it. The discussion petered out after that, and Slush promised to meet him again at Monday. Zorian was lost in thought as he went back to Amaya's house, wondering whether anything would come out of the whole spider investigation. Probably not, considering how seriously it was taken by Slush, but still. He'd have to prod the man for additional details after a week or so. Break. Zorian tapped his foot impatiently as he waited for Amaya to open the door. He had the key to the front door, but that was no help. Amaya had an annoying habit of leaving the key in the lock, and today was no exception. He couldn't enter without her help. She probably liked it that way. The sound of unlocking brought his attention back to the door itself, which flung open to reveal a concerned-looking Amaya staring at him. Did something happen? He asked. Did Kirill do something stupid while he was gone? I should be the one asking that, she said. Where were you? You were supposed to be back hours ago. Zorian floundered. What's the problem? It's not like I'm coming in the middle of the night or anything. The annoyed look she was giving him told him he shouldn't have said that. Not that he understood why. It's not like there was a rule saying he had to rush back home after class, after all. Back in Surin, his parents never cared what he did in his free time, so long as he didn't neglect his duties or embarrass them in the process. It was an alien feeling to have someone concerned for him just because he didn't come home on time. Look, I'm sorry but I had to meet with my divination instructor after class and the meeting sort of dragged on, he said. Really, Miss Karashka, you're going to lose your nerves if you freak out every time I'm late from classes. It's not the first time I've been held up after class, and it's certainly not going to be the last. She sighed and chewed him inside, apparently somewhat mollified by his speech. In the future, try to notify me when you're going to be late, Amaya said. Surely there is some piece of magic that can transfer messages within city limits, yes? That was a good idea, Zorian had to admit. I'll see what I can find, he promised. Good, Amaya said. Your sister has been asking for you for a while now, you know? Zorian groaned. She hasn't been a bother, hasn't she? No, she's a little angel, Amaya said, waving his concerns away. Zorian silently rolled his eyes at the idea of Kirill being an angel. If Kirill was so nice, then why did Amaya want him to come home so badly? She spent most of the day drawing, playing with the magic cube he gave her, and talking with Kenna. Or should that be talking at Kenna? I swear, that child is far too quiet. I have to talk to Kale about it one of these days. It's not normal for a child to be so withdrawn. Zorian quietly nodded, pleased that the cube he made was such a success. It was nothing special, just a simple stone cube with a bunch of light-emitting sigils arranged into a childish puzzle. He found a design in one of the books Nora recommended to him back when she had been tutoring him in spell formulas and decided making one would be doubly useful. It would give him some practical experience using spell formula and give Kirill something to pass the time with. Sounds like she had fun today, Zorian remarked. What did she need me for, then? Imaya gave him a strange look. You're her big brother. She doesn't need a special reason to miss you. And the real reason? Zorian pressed. Kana dozed off and your toy ran out of mana and went inert, Imaya finally admitted after a second of silence. Ah, Zorian nodded. He noticed the design had very little in the way of mana storage, but he wasn't feeling confident enough to redesign it while creating the cube. There was a reason why the cube had such rudimentary mana reserves. After all, large concentrations of mana tended to explode if handled inappropriately, and the cube was meant to be practice for beginners. Beginners that could totally botch things during the first couple of tries. Considering how many problems he had with simply recreating the design on the stone cube, he felt he had made the right choice when he had decided not to mess with the base design. He would simply make more of them if Kirill still wanted to play with one. It was good practice, anyway. She's in her room, I guess? No, she's in your room, reading your books, Imaya said casually. Zorian's eye twitched, resisting the urge to march straight into his room and throw Kirill out. In reality, he was lucky to have a room to call his own at all. Imaya still hadn't found anyone willing to rent the other room in the house, and Zorian was grateful for it, since it meant he could keep the room for himself. Unfortunately, his ability to keep Kirill out of it was completely non-existent. Kirill had no inhibitions about coming and going there whenever she pleased, and Imaya was even less inclined to stop her than their mother had been back in Suren. She seemed to find Kirill's behavior natural. And the little imp knew it. She knew she could get away with just about everything, since Imaya liked her better than she did him, and she exploited it to the hilt. That's why, when Zorian loudly entered the room, she completely ignored him. She was lying on his bed with an open book in front of her, her feet comfortably resting on his pillow. As he watched her, she reached towards the plate of biscuits Imaya had brought her, intent on scattering even more crumbs over his bed sheets. Hey! She protested. Those are mine. Get your own biscuits. Zorian ignored her and studied the plate full of biscuits he had snatched away from his demonic little sister. You know, originally I just wanted to get your attention and stop you from making an even bigger mess than you already have, but they do look kind of tasty. No. Kirill wailed as he opened his mouth, threatening to swallow a handful of biscuits at once. She seemed reluctant to leave his bed to get them back, though. She probably knew he wouldn't allow her to claim her spot back easily should she ever relinquish it, clever little imp that she was. Tell you what, he said, closing his mouth and putting the biscuits back on the plate. I'll give you your biscuits if you get rid of all the crumbs you put on my bed. Kirill immediately swept her hands over the sheets a couple of times, pushing all the crumbs to the floor in front of the bed. Her task done, she flashed him a cheeky smile. Ha ha, said Zorian humorlessly. Now go get a broom and do it properly. I'll eat a biscuit for every minute this mess remains in a room. He punctuated his words by shoving one of the biscuits into his mouth. They were quite good actually. Kirill let out a cry of protest and jumped off the bed in a huff. She unsuccessfully tried to retrieve her plate of biscuits, but when she realized she couldn't make him give it back and when he had a second one, she instead ran off to get a broom and a dustpan. Apparently she also complained to Imaya, because several minutes later she showed up with another plate of biscuits, so he didn't have to steal from his little sister. Whatever. Sadly, even after he recovered his bed from Kirill's clutches, she still returned to his room. Currently she was sprawled over his chest, having collapsed atop of him when he closed his eyes for a second. Why are you still here, Kiri? Zorian sighed. Kirill didn't answer at first, being too busy climbing over Zorian's body like he was an inanimate object that didn't feel pain and discomfort. Once she lay firmly on the bed with him, having wriggled sufficient free space for herself, she spoke. I'm bored, she said. Your puzzle broke, by the way. It didn't break, Zorian said. It just ran out of mana. I can make you a new one tomorrow if you want. Okay. A short silence descended between them and Zorian closed his eyes to take a little nap. Zorian? Kirill suddenly prompted. Yes? Zorian asked. "What's a Morlock?" Zorian opened his eyes and looked to the side, fixing Kirill with a curious expression. "You don't know what a Morlock is?" he asked incredulously. "I just know they're these white-haired blue-eyed people," Kirill said. "And that people don't like them very much. And that Kale is one. But Mother never wanted to tell me what the deal with them is." "She didn't, huh?" mumbled Zorian. "No," confirmed Kirill. "She said a young lady like me shouldn't talk about those kind of things." In the interest of avoiding an argument, Zorian refrained from making a snide comment about whether or not Kirill qualified as a lady. Not even a derisive snort. Someone should give him a medal for self-control. "Basically," Zorian said, "they are a race of underground humans. Though most of them don't live underground anymore. The disappearance of the gods hit their civilization hard, and the other denizens of the dungeon have largely driven them out to the surface. Ecosian settlers sort of helped the process along by kicking them while they were down and burning down a couple of their more prominent settlements." "Oh," Kirill said. "But that doesn't explain why people don't like them. Sounds like they should be angry at us more than we should be at them. And Kale doesn't look like he hates us. Kale is probably totally ignorant of his ancestral culture. I understand a lot of Morlocks are. And the reason people don't like them is that the old Morlocks had some pretty barbaric customs. They liked sacrificing people to their gods, and seem to have been cannibals," said Zorian. "Cannibals?" Kirill squealed. "They ate people? Why?" "Hard to say," Zorian shrugged. Ecosian settlers were more interested in condemning them for their practices than understanding why they did what they did. "Well, yeah, they ate people," Kirill said. "That's evil and disgusting. Don't tell me they're still doing that?" "Don't be ridiculous," Zorian scoffed. "The authorities would never let them get away with something like that." "Oh," said Kirill. "That's good. Is that why people don't like them? They're afraid the Morlocks are going to eat them?" "It contributes," Zorian sighed. "I lost count of the number of rumors I've heard about Morlocks supposedly kidnapping children off the street to eat them or whatnot. But there is more to it. The Morlocks have their own brand of magic, which is currently banned just about everywhere, but a lot of Morlocks still practice it. The guild calls it blood magic." "Sounds sinister," Kirill remarked. "It does, doesn't it?" Zorian said. "There is no official information about what blood magic actually is, but most people think it has something to do with sacrifice. The story is that Morlocks could use a ritual killing of a person or animal to power their spells. Modern Morlocks can't exactly kill a bunch of people at whim, but supposedly they still engage in animal sacrifice, both for magical and religious reasons." Kirill snuggled in closer to him, shuddering. "I'm glad Kale and Kana aren't like that," she said. "Me too, Kiri," said Zorian, patting her on the head. "Me too." Chapter 016 We Need to Talk. Tearing out a piece of paper from one of his notebooks, Zorian wrote down a short message for Imaya, explaining that he had another of his divination lessons with Slush and would thus be late today. He still didn't see what the big deal about being late was, but he really didn't want to argue about it. Of course, writing the message was one thing and getting it to Imaya was another. He was at the academy currently, and it was a long way from there to Imaya's place. He was pretty sure he had a solution, though. He had found plenty of spells for long-range communication, and although not many were within his ability to cast or suitable for his purposes, one of the spell combinations seemed promising. Basically, he was going to make a paper airplane and animate it to fly under its own power. A simple locator spell should guide it towards Imaya. The method worked when he tested it with Kirill, but that was over considerably smaller distances. Undeterred by the somewhat experimental nature of his actions, he folded the piece of paper into a paper plane and cast his spells on it before flinging it out of the nearest window. It sailed away out of sight soon enough, tracking its target. Well, classes were over, and the message sent. Time to find Slush. Somewhat unsurprisingly, Zorian discovered Slush had arranged their second meeting in another tavern. Of course. Undeterred, Zorian walked into the place and tried to ignore the stares of the other patrons as he scanned for Slush among them. Slush wasn't there. Did Zorian find the right place, or had Slush simply decided not to show up? He did have a bit of trouble finding the place, since Slush had given very vague directions to it, but Zorian was sure this was it. He was just about to leave the tavern to see if he had missed something when he realized it. Something was wrong. He felt an almost unnatural desire to leave this place. If he hadn't spent a dozen or so restarts suffering through Chiron's resistance training, he probably wouldn't have noticed it, but there was a compulsion effect targeting him. He pulled out his divination compass and murmured a quick locator spell, seeking out Slush. The needle immediately pointed towards an unassuming brown-haired man in factory worker get-up sitting in the left corner. Sighing, Zorian shuffled over to the man and sat on one of the chairs facing his table. "Can't I help you?" the man asked in a painfully scratchy voice, staring at Zorian with hollow, bloodshot eyes. Very creepy. Very uninviting. Instead of answering, Zorian muttered a quick dispel. A wave of dispelling force rushed towards the man, disrupting the illusion. The creepy man melted away to show Slush pouting at him like a little kid. "I must say, I didn't expect that," Slush said. "I figured you'd enter and leave the tavern at least 3 times before you figured it out. I dare say you just broke the betting pool, only 2 people voted for you getting it right away." Out of the corner of his eye Zorian saw 2 of the bar patrons giving him a thumbs up. "Can you drop the compulsion spell now?" Zorian sighed. "I don't think I'll be able to pay attention to you with this constantly hanging over my head all the time." "Oh. Right," said Slush, snapping his fingers. Zorian's head cleared immediately and the desire to bolt out of the tavern evaporated. "So what exactly was the point of that?" Zorian asked. "I wanted to see where your observation skills stand," Slush said, taking a sip from his glass. "Divination is one of the trickier magical disciplines, because failure is not obvious. You could perform a divination flawlessly and still get nothing out of it. You could mess it up totally and not even realize you did something wrong. Ask the wrong question, interpret the results incorrectly, or fail to take an important variable into account, and it's all just wasted effort. Experience can help you minimize those kind of issues, but it helps to be naturally perceptive. I guess getting it right immediately means I scored really well." Zorian tried. "It means you're off to a good start," Slush said. "We're not done yet." And with that, Slush reached out across the table and caught him by his wrist before he could pull his arm away. All sights and sounds around Zorian instantly disappeared, his surroundings replaced by an inky silent void. The only things he could still see and hear was his own body and Slush, who seemed to be sitting on thin air, what with his chair being replaced by the same darkness that consumed everything else. "Don't," Slush warned when Zorian tried to wrench his hand free of Slush's grasp. "It's a harmless spell, and it will disappear the moment we break skin contact. If it makes you feel any better, I'm suffering the same effects while it lasts." "What's the point of this, then?" asked Zorian. "How many people were present in the tavern when I used this spell on you?" Slush said. "What?" Zorian tried to look around him and immediately realized what the darkness was supposed to accomplish. "Oh. You want to see how much I noticed about the state of the tavern?" "How many people?" repeated Slush. Zorian racked his brains for a moment. He did get a pretty good look at the patrons of the tavern when he was scanning them, trying to spot Slush, but he never actually counted them. And it's possible someone left the tavern while he was talking to Slush without him noticing it. 23? He tried. Close. How many trophies are lined up on the wall next to our table? Unfortunately, while Zorian had noticed the trophies, he didn't give them more than a single glance. 15 more questions from Slush in that vein, and Zorian was no longer feeling so confident about this. Slush finally let go of his hand and the rest of the tavern immediately appeared again. "Oh, don't feel so down," Slush said. "You're not half bad, really. And honestly, I wouldn't have cancelled our lessons just because you did badly in something like this. How are you standing with divination, anyway? Standard second-year graduate, or do you have something extra?" I know a bunch of library divinations and I have mastered the north-finding shaping exercise, Zorian said. What, north-finding exercise already? Asked Slush in surprise. Personally, Zorian felt that exercise was very easy. Well, there goes the homework I intended to give you after today's session. Anyway, today I'll teach you how to analyze objects. He reached into the pockets of his long coat and placed a number of objects on the table in front of them: a sealed envelope, an old pocket watch, a locked box, some kind of giant nut, a spell rod, and a fancy-looking glove. Analyzing objects is something I do a lot, so I figure it's a good thing to start with. Identifying what the object does, finding out who handled it last, what kind of magics and protections are placed on it. You could make an entire career out of it, and some do, Slush said. I hear you're interested in a job at the Spell Forges, so this is bound to be rather useful for you. So what do I do? Asked Zorian. Now I teach you the spells you'll need and you practice on these, Slush said, pointing at the various objects on the table. It was a very productive session after that, and it got Zorian thinking. Based on the man's various comments, Slush was clearly somewhat high in Sioria's police hierarchy. Maybe he could do something useful with the information about the invasion without tipping off the organizers? It might be worth dying once or twice to find out. I really must thank you, Mr. Exeteri, Zorian said. You're a lot better at this than I initially gave you credit for. It's fine, Slush said. I actively cultivate a somewhat unflattering facade. It helps people relax around me. So what are you trying to butter me up for, anyway? Zorian sighed. How should he put this then? Could you put up some privacy words first? Zorian asked. Slush raised an eyebrow at the request but nodded in agreement soon afterwards. He quickly set up some sort of spells over their table and then waited expectantly. He would have to get the man to teach him some of those protective spells in one of the restarts. I have heard there is a plot to smuggle war trolls into the city during the summer festival, after bombarding the city with artillery magic during the fireworks launches, Zorian said. Slush immediately sat up straighter, so at least it seemed he wasn't going to get this mess out of hand. Now he just had to make sure he doesn't get carted off to the police station. And I don't suppose you'll tell me where you heard that? Asked Slush suspiciously. Can't, Zorian confirmed. It seemed reliable to me, though. I see, Slush sighed. He poured some more alcohol into his glass and took a sip. I hate the summer festival, you know? Virtually all buildings have their warding schemes loosened while it lasts. The huge amount of visitors makes it hard to spot troublemakers in time, and the mayor and other bigheads want all sorts of stupid things done in preparation for it. It's a perfect time for criminals and terrorists of all stripes to go wild in the city. Huh? Zorian didn't actually know that until now. So how are these people going to smuggle in goddamn war trolls of all things, and what are they trying to accomplish? Through the dungeon, said Zorian. As for the purpose, I honestly don't know. Anything else you can tell me? Slush asked. Not really, no. Then I have just one more question, Slush said. Why are you telling this to me, of all people? There are some very high-placed people involved in this, and I'm not sure who I can trust, Zorian said. You seem like a fairly influential person who is unlikely to be involved. Also, I'm hoping you won't drag me off to a cell for questioning. He didn't actually know whether high-placed people were involved or not, of course, but he felt it was a good bet they were. He failed to see how an invasion of this kind of magnitude could be organized without the cooperation of some very influential person inside city administration. I'm tempted, Slush admitted. But all you'd really have to do is claim it was all a prank and I'd pretty much have to let you go. The Mage Guild was founded because mages didn't trust civilian law enforcement to judge them fairly, and they guard their privileges jealously. They would get you out within days and perform their own investigation. You'd get a slap on the wrist for being stupid, and I'd spend the next year being punished by my bosses for falling for a childish trick and getting the Mage Guild angry at us. Zorian fumbled. Slush sounded more than a little bit bitter. He didn't know Zoria's police force harbored such resentment towards the Mage Guild. "It's fine," Slush said. "I'm not angry at you. I guess I'll do some investigating and we'll talk more about it after our next session. You try finding out more from these mysterious sources of yours." Zorian left the tavern in a good mood, though it was somewhat dampened by fear of assassins. Hopefully Slush would be discreet in his investigation. When he got to Amaya's place he was told by Amaya that she got his message, but she was still fairly unhappy with him. Apparently the paper plane rammed straight into the back of her head when delivering his message, and that was dangerous. What if it had rammed into her face and poked out her eye? Some people were never happy. Break. The house was calm, the only two occupants currently present being Zorian and Kirill. And thankfully, Kirill was amusing herself with doodling into her notebook instead of pestering him. That was good, because trying to levitate a snail, like Zorian was currently doing, was not at all easy. Not only was the snail alive, and thus inherently resistant to magic, but it was also actively fighting the levitation effect, twisting and bending in the air in an attempt to break free of the unseen force holding it aloft. He was cheating a little. He was actually levitating the shell, which was largely immobile and much more solid than the actual snail. The real test of skill would be levitating a slug or something, but, well, he was having enough trouble with the damn snail at the moment. "Poor snail," Kirill remarked from the sidelines. "Why don't you let this one go and find another one to torture? It's going to end up traumatized if you keep this up." "I'm not torturing it," Zorian protested, trying to split his attention between holding the snail in the air and talking with Kirill. "It's completely unharmed. I'm not even sure if snail brains are complex enough to be traumatized. The damn thing is as enthusiastic about escaping as it was when I started this." Kirill looked as if she was about to argue but then just grunted and melted back into her chair. "Where is he?" she said after a minute of silence. "I don't know, Kiri," sighed Zorian. "Be patient. He isn't even late yet. Maybe we should start without him?" she tried. "No, we should not," snapped Zorian. The snail wobbled in the air, its eye stalks swinging wildly as it sensed its bonds weakening and redoubled its efforts. "Honestly, Kiri, you can be so callous sometimes. The only reason I'm even doing this is because Kale asked me to. You should be thanking him for letting you participate." "You're the one to talk about callousness," Kirill grumbled. "You'd rather help a stranger you met a week ago than your own little sister. And I am grateful. Then be nice and wait." Zorian interrupted her, slowly lowering the snail into his hand. He clearly wasn't going to get any more work done today. He'll be here soon enough. "If you want something to do, go release the snail back into the garden." "What? No way." Zorian raised an eyebrow. "Weren't you just advocating its freedom?" "Well yeah, but I'm not gonna touch it or anything. It's slimy and disgusting and ooh." Zorian rolled his eyes and put the snail into a small box by his side. He would release it outside later. A sound of door opening signaled Kale's arrival. "I'm here," Kale said. "I'm not late, I hope?" "How did you know he was coming?" Kirill asked suspiciously, turning to Zorian. "Alarm spells," Zorian said dismissively. "And no, Kale, you're not late." Though Kirill was impatient like usual. "Anyway, you said you need my help to catch up to third-year curriculum, right? Which part do you need help with?" "I really don't know," Kale said. "As I said, my education was somewhat spotty, so even though I know a lot of things, there are things that formally trained mages take for granted that I'm not even aware of. Why don't you give me a brief overview of your first 2 years and we'll see where to go from there? Ilsa said she will test me 3 months from now, so there is plenty of time to work with." Zorian gave his sister a knowing look, but she was avoiding his eyes. He was sure that Kale knew exactly where he was deficient knowledge-wise, but Kiri had probably asked him to play along for her, being largely ignorant about magic herself. He really didn't know why she was so adamant to learn magic right now, as opposed to later, in a proper school environment. Honestly, as much as he cared for his sister and liked Kale, He probably wouldn't be taking Kirill with him to see Urya too often. He spent most of his time in the house dealing with Kirill, Amaya or Kil and occasionally Kana, leaving little time for his personal self-study. Relatively speaking, of course, Kirill already complained he spent too much time studying and not enough having fun or paying attention to her. But all things considered, he could take it easy every once in a while. He could set aside a few hours on helping Kale study for his test, even if he would never actually live to take it during the time loop, and if Kirill wants to listen, and then so what? He gave them both a brief explanation of the first 2 years in the academy. Magic-wise, most of the first year was spent on teaching students how to consciously and consistently draw on their magical core, mostly by making them activate various magical objects. There was even a first-year class called Operation of Magic Items, which was exactly what it said in the title. They also worked on their memorization by doing increasingly complex strings of gestures and chants shown to them by teachers, a practice for later study of invocations. The rest was theory. Introductions to various magical traditions and disciplines, learning how to understand the basics of Ecosian language, biology, history, geography, law and mathematics. Not all of it was strictly related to magic, but wait, who's that? We'll have to postpone that for the moment, he said, looking at the door. Someone as, before he could say anything, the door slammed open and Taven barged into his room in her usual aggressive manner. She scanned the room quickly and immediately stalked towards him when she noticed him. Coming here. He finished with a long-suffering sigh. Roach. She exclaimed excitedly. You're just the man I... Wait, am I interrupting something? Yes? Zorian tried. Never mind, it will only take a minute. She shoved a newspaper into his face. Did you see this? He sighed and snatched the newspapers out of her hand so he could put them on the table. There, now he could actually see what she was taking about. Let's see. Academy student kills Oganj. Yesterday morning Zak Nevada shocked the world when he announced in front of gathered reporters that he had slain Oganj, the feared dragon that had terrorized northern Altasia for more than a century. Naturally, such a bold claim requires suitable proof, and the young Nevada heir had certainly delivered when he summoned the dragon's corpse for inspection. Alliance officials invited in for the occasion had confirmed the body almost certainly belongs to the infamous Terror of the North, although further examination is necessary before they are willing to present Zak with a promised bounty for killing the beast. Zorian read the article in stony silence. He was dimly aware of Kirill and Kale staring over his shoulder so they could see what had captivated his attention like that, but he didn't let that distract him. Was this the reason for all those short restarts? Because Zak wanted to kill a dragon? Zorian wasn't sure what to think about that. On one hand, the mage dragon was a menace, and killing him was an impressive feat. On the other hand, it seemed like a waste of time and effort. What did Zak really gain from this, other than combat experience? Dragon magics were of no use to humans, and Zak was already so rich that he wouldn't gain much from Oganj's horde. Whatever game Zak was playing, Zorian couldn't figure it out. Or did the other time traveler just do whatever popped into his head at any particular moment? Hey, Roach, you went to class with this guy, right? Taven prodded after a while. Yeah, he confirmed. He was supposed to be in my class this year too, but failed to show up when the classes started. He ran away from home, Taven said. There was a recent scandal about that a week ago. They asked him about it in the article, but he kind of dodged the question there. Zorian nodded. Zak simply told the reporters he had a great number of disagreements with his former guardian and refused to elaborate. There was an interesting story in there, Zorian was sure, but if the newspapers hadn't managed to dig something up on the whole thing, then Zorian definitely wasn't going to accomplish much by poking his nose where it didn't belong. Zak also told the newspapers he intends to go back to school for a few months when he was prompted for his immediate plans. Great. He would have to lay low during the next few restarts, until Zak got tired of the academy again. Isn't Oganj the dragon that annihilated an army sent to kill him? Kirill asked. Or was that mother just trying to scare me? A small army, and Oganj lured it into a trap, Kale said. The general seemed to think Oganj would wait in his lair while the army approached. He instead decided to do something about it before it reached him. He carved exploding runes into the walls of a canyon and lured the army inside. The only reason anyone survived is that some of the mages teleported out before the whole thing collapsed on top of them. And I heard he killed one of the Immortal 11, too, Taven said. So how the hell did this Zack guy kill the thing? Is he some kind of legend or what? Why didn't you tell me you had that kind of guy in your class? Zorian sighed. What the hell was he supposed to tell her? Let me put it like this, he said carefully. During the first 2 years, Zack had trouble with just about everything. He was such a poor image that people weren't sure if he would pass his certification, and you know how easy that thing is. That doesn't make sense, Taven said. Even if the whole killing Oganj thing is a trick of some sort, he still summoned a corpse of a fully grown dragon. Even I can't summon something that big yet. I guess everything changed during the school break, Zorian shrugged. Somehow he went from a borderline failure to amazing genius between year 2 and 3. That's totally ridiculous, Taven huffed. How would that even work? Time travel? Suggested Zorian shamelessly. Like I said, ridiculous, Taven countered immediately. Are you sure he wasn't faking incompetence? I'm not sure of anything, Taven, Zorian said. And he really wasn't. Even after a whole year of being trapped inside a time loop, he still felt the entire situation was all kinds of crazy. And the few things I do know are so insane you wouldn't believe a word of it. Oh, now I just have to hear them, said Taven, crossing her arms in front of her chest defiantly. Go on, just try me. Tell, agreed Kirill. Kale didn't say anything, but Zorian could tell he was curious as well. He could tell them about the time loop, but even if they believed him, what would that accomplish? They were no more qualified to solve this mystery than he was, and if they went around telling that story to people they could blow his cover to Zack or possible third parties. Then again, he already told Haslush about the invasion, so he was already playing with fire in this restart. Oh, to hell with it, as if they'd ever believe him anyway. If I told you that Zack and I are time travelers perpetually reliving this first month of school, and that a giant army of monsters and hostile mages invades the city during the summer festival, what would you say? Taven raised her eyebrow at him. Well, go on, Zorian prompted. You're right, Taven sighed. I don't believe a word of it. So you're saying the things you know are that insane? At the very least, Zorian confirmed. Huh? Taven said speculatively. Sounds interesting, but you'll have to tell me those stories some other time. I kept you long enough, I think. See you around, Roach. Zorian watched as Taven left before turning back to Kale and Kirill. So, shall we continue where we left off? They both remained silent, staring at him. He said. Why are you staring at me like that? Is it true? Kirill asked fearfully. Are you really a time traveler? Zorian opened his mouth and closed it again. What? Your friend may be too oblivious to recognize an answer couched as a hypothetical, but we are not, Kale elaborated. You really do believe that, don't you? That you're a time traveler? Yes. If it's a delusion, it's a very convincing one, Zorian said carefully. The magics I learn in each iteration of this month transfer over into the next one. Insanity doesn't give the victim spells and shaping skills. I don't understand, Kirill complained. You and me both, Kiri, Zorian sighed. You and me both. Perhaps you should explain from the start? Kale suggested patiently. Tell us what you do understand. I lived through this month before, Zorian said after taking a moment to collect his thoughts. The first time, before I knew about the time loop, I did not bring Kirill with me to Seoria. What? Protested Kirill. Zorian, you jerk. I lived in one of the academy-provided apartments and I went to classes like normal, said Zorian, ignoring her. He glanced at Kale. You did too, but I didn't know you then. However, we had an extra classmate. Zack? Kale guessed. Yes, Zorian confirmed. Unlike the previous 2 years I shared a class with him, This time he was amazing. He solved every test perfectly, he had mastered hundreds of spells, and he was good enough at alchemy to impress you, of all people. Kale raised his eyebrow at him. Yes, Zorian assured. It was like he was completely transformed during the summer break. At the time I didn't care very much, I was curious as to how he accomplished it, but it was not my business to pry. And then the summer festival came, and everything went to hell. Artillery spells descended from the sky on the city, and an army of monsters followed in their wake. As I was running through the burning city, I witnessed Zack fighting the invaders. He was throwing high-level spells as if they were candy, fighting with a skill that no third-year student could possibly possess. He fared pretty well at first, but then a lich arrived at the scene and demolished him. He paused for a moment to consider his next words, but Kirill evidently didn't want to wait that long. And then what? Kirill asked. What happened next? What else? Zorian scoffed. We died. The lich cast some kind of weird spell at us, a chromantic spell, I am told, and we were instantly killed. So how did you go back in time then? Asked Kirill suspiciously. I have no idea. All I know is that I was suddenly back in my bed in Sioria, with you wishing me a good morning in that uniquely charming Kirill way. At first I thought this was something the lich did, but I would soon find out this was not an isolated occurrence. Every time I die, or at the end of the summer festival if I don't, my soul is transported back to that morning in Surin before I take a train to Sioria. They stared at him for a few seconds, and Zorian was already becoming certain they would suddenly start laughing and mocking him when Kirill decided to speak again. So you are a time traveler, but you can only go 1 month into the past and only until one specific day, said Kirill carefully. Zorian nodded. She understood that a lot better than Zorian had thought she would. And you don't control any of it, except by deliberately killing yourself. Yes, Zorian confirmed. You are the lamest time traveler ever, Kirill opinionated. And just like that the tension was broken. Break. It had been 3 days since he had told Kirill and Kale about the time loop, and he was honestly a little bit disappointed by their reactions. They both seemed to believe him, but neither was terribly affected. Both of them were still asking him questions about it whenever they could catch him alone, and he knew Kale was researching the topic in his free time, but they continued to go about their business as if nothing was wrong. They weren't even giving him weird glances when they thought he wasn't looking or anything. I told you already, I've only been in the time loop for a little over a year, Zorian told Kirill. I'm not even close to all-knowing and I can't answer these questions you keep asking me. I can't believe you've been going to school all this time, Kirill grumbled. I'd have quit after the second time. You'd have ended up mind-wiped or slaved to Zack in a heartbeat, Zorian retorted. There's a reason I'm doing this slowly and carefully. A gentle knock on his door stopped their argument short. Zorian was a bit paranoid about visitors ever since he had told Haslush about the invasion, and telling Kale and Kirill about it only increased that. Even though he had told Kale and Kirill not to spread the festival invasion part of the revelation to other people, he could never be sure if they had listened to him. Especially not Kirill. He kept expecting assassins to barge into the house any day now, but his paranoia had thankfully been groundless so far. Since only Kale knocked so lightly, Zorian had a pretty good idea who it was. Come in, Zorian invited. Instead of coming in, however, Kale remained standing in the doorway. We need to talk, Kale said, a hint of nervousness in his voice. Can you come into my room for a moment? Is it about time travel? Kirill said excitedly. Kale sighed. Kirill, I know you won't like this, but can you stay in your room while I talk to your brother? It's related to time travel, but it's a bit private. For a moment it looked like Kirill was going to complain, but then she shot him a speculative look and nodded in assent. As he watched her leave back to her room, grumbling all the way, Zorian had to admit he was a little jealous of Kale's ability to control Kirill. She never listened to him when he tried that sort of thing. Shrugging, Zorian followed Kale into his room, where the Morlunk boy promptly dragged a chest from under his bed and retrieved a mysterious black book with no title out of it. I've been looking into your problem. The last few days, Kale said. I may have found something. You did? Zorian asked excitedly. Kale opened the book he was carrying and leafed through for a few seconds before he found what he was looking for. He handed the open book to him and pointed at the page. Based on the chant you memorized from the Lich, and everything else you told me, I think this is the most likely spell he used, Kale said. Soul Meld, Zorian read aloud. Requires at least 2 targets. Causes target souls to merge and blend into one. Typically used as a component in more complicated rituals, which heavily modify the effects. If the spell is used in isolation, the resulting entity is virtually always rendered insane or otherwise defective from the stress of the merger. Commonly used in creation of familiar bonds, and soul bonds in general. That definitely sounded like a likely candidate for the spell, but where on earth had Kale found this? Frowning, Zorian leafed through the rest of the book. It was full of soul magic spells, and much of it was written in several unknown scripts that Zorian couldn't read. This wasn't the sort of thing you could find in the Academy library, least of all with just a student clearance. Which meant this was probably Kale's personal book. Kale, are you a necromancer? Asked Zorian carefully. A difficult question, Kale answered after a short pause. I do not enslave the dead, or curse people. There is more to soul magic than that, though. Well, this was just great. He told his secret to one of the few people who could actually do something to put him down permanently. And he was scolding Curiel about being reckless just a few minutes ago, too. He really was a giant idiot sometimes. But hey, what's done is done, and at least Kale didn't seem very hostile at the moment. If anything, the other boys seemed to be more afraid of Zorian than the other way around. I won't report you, if that's what you're worried about, Zorian said. Partially because he was deathly afraid of what the other boy would do to him if he tried. A necromancer, of all things. You agreed to keep quiet about my secret, so it would be hypocritical of me to betray yours without reason. Still, necromancy? I mean, soul magic? Kale gave him a weak smile. It's an interesting discipline, if unfairly judged. My teacher had an interest in it and I wanted to continue the tradition. Tradition, right. Zorian thought about pressing the matter further, but decided against it. Mistake or not, he could at least get some benefit out of this. He'd just met a decent-seeming necromancer willing to answer his questions. How often does that happen? So if the Lich performed a soul meld on me, why am I still? Well, me? Zorian asked. As I understand it, a spell like that would have fused my soul with Zack's completely. We would both cease to exist as individual people. Well, I must admit I am not an expert on soul magic by any means, said Kale. My primary strengths are alchemy and medicine, with soul magic being merely a side interest. That said, I assume the spell was simply stopped before it could complete the effect. It's entirely possible Zack committed suicide when he realized his soul was being targeted. It would have been a sensible course of action in this case, Zorian agreed. Though he didn't exactly give me the impression that he was aware of the danger when I talked to him. I suppose it could have been the amnesia playing tricks on him. Or he may have a contingency spell placed on him, set to kill him if it detects unauthorized tampering of his soul. You already said he may not be the originator of the time loop. Whoever placed the magic on him was doubtlessly aware of the danger, as the time loop you are trapped in is clearly a work of a skilled soul mage. Right. So since the spell was only allowed to work its magic for the moment, we were spared from the worst effect, Zorian mused. And I ended up with some kind of a soul bond that drags me along for the ride. Possibly. There was obviously some soul melding involved, in any case. Can you find out what the spell actually did? Maybe, Kale said slowly. Although this would involve spells. Soul magic spells, to be more precise. Are you sure you want to trust an evil, slimy necromancer with this? Yes, confirmed Zorian, rolling his eyes at Kale's dramatics. Maybe it wasn't the smartest thing to agree to, but he was honestly desperate for some answers. And he was getting an honest feeling from Kale. He was usually a good judge of character. It is true that I am leery of soul magic, but that doesn't mean I automatically hate you now. Go ahead and cast whatever spells you need. After 15 minutes of mysterious spellcasting which had no visible effect on him, and didn't even give him an uncomfortable feeling, Cale was forced to admit he didn't get much. The only thing the other boy could tell him was that he definitively didn't have a classical soul bond with Zack. If he was connected to the other time traveler, it was through something more exotic and subtle than that. "I'm sorry," Cale said. "I thought soul magic as grand as this would be blatantly obvious, but I guess I was wrong. Maybe if I tried it on Zack?" "There is no way to perform an examination on him without telling him the truth," Zorian said. "I'm not sure I want to do that yet." "Of course," Cale said. "Although I'm not sure what else I can do. I'd have to be a vastly better soul mage to help her with this, and if you're right I just don't have the time to become one. Even if you convinced me of all this right at the start of the time loop, and I'm not sure you could do that so soon, before I have gotten to know you a little, 1 month is not enough to get anywhere in a field like soul magic." Fumbled Zorian after a few seconds of silence. "Maybe you could teach me soul magic? You would be willing to do that?" Cale asked in mild amusement. "You said there is more to soul magic than cursing people and enslaving the dead," Zorian said. "And I really do need answers that only soul magic can provide. Also, if he learned soul magic personally he would no longer have to trust strangers to mess around with his soul. If someone had to cast soul magic, he'd rather it was him. Though I'm flattered you're willing to set aside your prejudices, the truth is you would never be good enough for what you want to do with it," Cale said. "Although most soul magic can be performed by normal mages like you, the really sophisticated spells require a certain amount of soul perception, a skill that can only be gained by drinking a special potion made from a properly harvested dirge moth chrysalis." "And is the potion rare?" "Dirge moths spend most of their lives in the ground," Cale said. "For 23 years they live their lives as larvae before emerging from the soil on massive swarms of poisonous dirge moths. The moths live for exactly 1 day before laying their eggs and dying. In case you were curious, the last emergence of the moth swarms was less than a decade ago. There will be no dirge moth chrysalises for at least another decade," realized Zorian. Cale nodded. "And the potion requires a fresh chrysalis, they cannot be preserved. And there is no other way to gain soul perception?" "Maybe there is, but I only know of this one," Cale said. "There are some rituals involving human sacrifice that claim to provide the same benefit to the mage, but I have never tried them and I suspect you would not want to either." "Definitely not," Zorian agreed. After a few more minutes of discussion Zorian left Cale's room, lost in thoughts. He wasn't quite willing to give up on the idea of learning soul magic, but he had more than enough on his plate right now so he wouldn't push it. There were plenty of other restarts in which to try that later. The moment he had entered the room and closed the door behind him he felt a very familiar touch on his mind. It was not unlike the time he had ventured with Tivan into the sewers, yet a lot subtler and less alien, like cobwebs brushing against the edges of his thoughts. He immediately panicked, his eyes swinging from one corner of the room to another in search of his assailant while he tried to mentally block the presence from his mind. Despite his practice with Chiron, he found himself unable to do so. "So you're open." A clear, confident voice resonated through his mind. Unlike the last time, there was no pain or confusing images involved. But that was somehow even more terrifying. In his last encounter, his opponent was obviously unused to dealing with humans. This one knew exactly what it was doing. "Interesting. You have met one of us before? This will be easier than I thought then." "There. Did the shadows in that corner move?" He was about to cast a magic missile at the spot when his whole body suddenly froze and refused to listen to him. A dark shadow suddenly jumped from the patch of darkness in the corner of his room and landed on his bed, right in front of him. It was a spider, like he suspected, but it looked nothing like what he expected. The spider was relatively small for a giant spider breed, no bigger than Zorian's chest, and a lot more compact than the spindly, long-legged varieties that people usually associated with spiders. Racking his brain, Zorian identified it as a type of jumping spider. As the creature turned around to face him, Zorian suddenly found himself staring at a pair of giant, solid black eyes that gave the spider a surprisingly human-like face. There was another pair of smaller eyes on its forehead, for the lack of a better word, but the two big ones kept drawing Zorian's attention. The other thing he noticed, of course, was a pair of giant fangs that looked like they could pierce his skull with ease. "Greetings, Zorian Kaczynski," the spider spoke telepathically. "I have been wanting to meet you for a while now. You and I need to have a long, talk." Tope continued, "Thanks for listening.